As per a report, India aims to have 175 gigawatt of renewable powered energy by 2022 and 450 gigawatt by 2030. These targets will require the setting up of massive infrastructure and upgrading current infrastructure, both of which are financially intensive tasks. India has also made commitments to reducing its energy intensity and lowering its carbon emission footprints in line with the Paris Agreement. If the country is to achieve 175 gigawatt by 2022, we require a total investment of approximately $150 to 200 billion. To understand this in detail, I would like to invite Mr. Sumant Sinha, Chairman and Managing Director, ReNew Power, to speak on catalyzing India's energy transition through green finance. Over to you, Mr. Sinha.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure to be speaking at the Energy Leadership Summit of the Economic Times. Let me congratulate the organizers for having pulled this through so effectively, despite all the COVID hardships that we have faced in the last few months. The climate change challenge is an existential crisis of our times and has a profound effect on human life. Soaring temperatures, extreme weather events, rising sea levels are now all a constant feature of our lives. There have been wildfires in Australia and the United States, which have been some of the worst in history. And closer to our own country, cyclones such as Tokte and Yas have caused significant devastation and loss of life and property. Such frequent and rapidly reoccurring instances prove beyond an iota of doubt that we are now at the tipping point of survival and that we cannot show complacency anymore in tackling climate change. The upcoming COP26 focuses on limiting global temperature increases to below 1.5 degrees centigrade from the pre-industrial level. The expectation going into the conference is that all developed economies would become net zero by 2050, and all developing economies should commit to be net zero by 2060. China has announced a pledge for attaining net zero emissions by 2060, following a peak in emissions before 2030. China was then rapidly followed by South Korea and Japan with 2050 carbon neutrality goals. The European Union and the UK have also raised their greenhouse gas reduction targets for 2030 to a 68% and 55% reduction against the 1990 levels respectively. With the US turning to the Paris Agreement, the pitch for more net zero emissions targets is now gaining ground. Considering that India is an important pivot in the global economic chain, our participation and efforts to achieve our nationally determined contributions, or NDC targets, will only further solidify efforts to tackle climate change globally. However, it is important to understand a few crucial aspects here. India is at a nascent stage of our development. Millions of our fellow citizens still do not have access to electricity, modern sanitation, and drinking water. This is coupled with the demand for affordable energy, which keeps growing strongly, especially with rapid urbanization, modernization, and a burgeoning middle class. To meet these demands and for other energy needs, we are still heavily dependent on fossil fuels, which currently still account for 60% of India's installed power capacity. Hence, it is not realistic to suddenly replace fossil fuels with renewables. Despite these challenges, the Government of India has initiated a robust and ambitious renewables program, setting targets as high as 450 gigawatts of renewable energy generation capacity by 2030, up from the existing 90 gigawatts of currently installed capacity. India has also committed to reducing the emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% below the 2005 levels, and increasing share of non-fossil fuel in the total capacity of power generation to 40% by 2030. To fund this target will be a Herculean effort on its own. India's NDCs estimates that the country will require close to $2.5 trillion from 2015 to 2030, or roughly $170 billion per year for climate action. Given the current rates of penetration and the overall health of the sector, combined with the slowdown created by the COVID-19 pandemic, The government will have to find new and alternative ways to finance this transition and incentivize private sector participation to scale up investments for a sustainable and transformational impact. Perhaps this should be synergized by an influx of international investments coming our way. Recently, India has emerged as an important destination for investors seeking assets that are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. However, the incorporation of ESG factors is still not fully developed, although it is moving rapidly in the right direction. I believe that the improvement in disclosure requirements for ESG investing and encouraging green instruments will definitely increase funding for the sector. And I think this is an area that we must look at encouraging and moving forward. And in that regard, I must say that the authorities and various regulatory agencies have taken some positive steps in this regard. For example, in 2008, the RBI issued a circular to raise awareness in the banking sector of the growing global prevalence of corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, and non-financial reporting. Since then, there has been pressure to improve corporate disclosure on capital markets, and issuance of green bonds have grown. In 2012, SEBI introduced a requirement for the top 100 companies by market capitalization to issue business responsibility reporting, BRR. And as we move ahead now from FY 2022-23, it would be mandatory for companies to file a new disclosure report, the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report, or BRSR. The update of Indian sustainability reporting standards is expected to provide greater transparency in the disclosure of ESG-related information as it incorporates metrics to measure material environmental risks, energy consumption, among others, which are previously absent, and essentially extends the responsibility of reporting and taking action for corporates to Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, which essentially requires corporates to not just look at their own immediate consumption of resources, but also look at the supply chains and see, in fact, whether the supply chains are also, from where they are acquiring products and so on, are also equally compliant to these same sorts of standards. Another promising route for investments in the country that is now rapidly developing is via the green bond market. As of 2021, India has the second largest emerging green bond market after China. Despite the innovations in the field since 2015, the Indian green bond market hasn't been able to diversify itself much in terms of assets, which remain focused mostly on renewable energy projects. Since 2018, green bonds have constituted only 0.7% of all the bonds issued in India. There are many reasons for this, including asymmetric information about the use of proceeds. They may not finally end up going towards green projects. Governance issues, higher risk perception, lack of credit ratings or rating guidelines for green projects and bonds, maturity mismatches in green projects and their financing increase the cost of borrowing. Additionally, green projects often have a high upfront cost, with some cost-saving features only applicable in the long term. And therefore, not all corporates are highly incentivized to do things which qualify for green bond financing. As we now ride the renewables wave and look forward to achieving the targets set by the government, it will really be crucial to find adequate solutions to expand the market and help a higher and safer influx of investments. I believe that increased coordination between investment and environmental policies and transparent policy framework at the national and state level will strengthen efforts to expand the market. Other major initiatives that can be taken include deepening of the corporate bond market itself, which, as we all know in India, is fairly shallow, standardization of green investment terminology, consistent corporate reporting, removing information asymmetry and a national measurement, and reporting and verification platform for tracking climate finance. I should say that in our own journey in the last decade or so, ReNew Power has emerged as one of the stronger players in the sector. And we've actually been enabled in this by a cross-section of well-known international private equity, sovereign wealth funds, and pension funds focused investors into our company. most of our investors believe in the principles of ESG investing, and they have therefore instilled that faith and discipline in us as well. Our sector, of course, as we all know, is very capital intensive, and therefore having access to financing on a regular basis, both debt and equity, is fairly critical for our sector. I would also say that we have spent our first 2-3 years in the past in establishing our wind business and crossing a commission capacity of 500 megawatts by 2015. But since then, along with the growth of the market, our growth has also increased substantially. But as a result of that, we've also had to raise financing from a number of different sources. And accessing the financing sources from multilaterals, green bond investors, domestic banks, NBFCs, the domestic bond market, have all been things that we've been looking at doing and developing the market for. Unfortunately, a number of these markets are relatively thin, relatively shallow. And we really need to ensure that these markets become much deeper if we are to do the kind of funding that I talked about earlier, which is almost $170 billion of climate funding every year. So we have to make sure that these markets deepen and that we get much more capital to come in. I think one of the issues that we also have to look at is to broaden the marketplace, to broaden the financing markets. We have to be able to raise financing from the international markets as well. And that is where green bonds in the international bond markets is a very important tool from which to raise capital. But it's important for all of us, for those of us who borrow from that market, to essentially hedge our exposures, because all of our revenues are in rupees. And the last thing we would like is for there to be significant financing risk coming up in our sector. And so hedging, FX hedging becomes very important. And therefore, the depth of the FX markets is equally critical. And the same applies to multilateral borrowings as well, where those borrowings are in foreign currencies. Again, they have to be hedged. So while the Indian market in a number of cases is relatively shallower, the international markets are relatively deeper, there does need to be this bridge of FX hedging, which has to provide the depth in the market that allows us to all raise capital in the international markets. So I think that is the way in which we can essentially raise more capital. I think that is something that we really have to focus on building into the system quite substantially. And I think at the same time, the Reserve Bank of India has to also recognize that companies in India that are tapping into overseas markets should be allowed to have relaxed end-use restrictions or not be subject to some of the restrictions that the RBI does subject Indian borrowers from overseas markets to. And particularly for climate finance or particularly for green bonds, relax some of those requirements, again, to allow us to deepen the markets. The other thing I would say is that as far as the domestic markets are concerned, as I said earlier, unfortunately, the markets in India are somewhat shallow. And I do have a concern about whether the kind of financing that is required will be available. If you look at the different markets in India, where you have the bank market, public sector banks, which are the largest parts of the banking system in India, are unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, not really active lenders to the infrastructure space in which most of the green financings fall under. They're not big lenders in general to the infrastructure sector. And so therefore, that is one big part of the market that unfortunately is not growing and where we need more capital to be coming from. The second thing is the NBFC market. We all know that that market has gone through a lot of difficulty. And so really, apart from dedicated lenders like the Power Finance Corporation and REC, we don't really have a lot of other NBFCs lending to this sector as well. And as we all know, the domestic bond market is relatively shallow. We do not have a credit culture in the country. Most of the institutional investors that invest in the bond market typically confine themselves to AA and AAA nature of projects, do not account for any kind of allowance for green financing. And so therefore, that market is also relatively shallow. And so my concern really is that as we look to the future and as we look to raise these large amounts of financing, we have an issue where the domestic market is shallow, is not really growing as much as it needs to grow, and certainly is not going to be able to do the multiple fold of financing that we need to be doing in the future. And the international market, which has the depth, which has the sophistication to do investments in ESG and in green bonds and so on, that market can be accessed only through the method of hedging, because without that, I think companies will end up taking too much risk on the FX exposure. So both of those markets have certain limitations, and we need really innovative solutions to be emerging here. One of those really could be around multilateral corporations coming in and providing credit enhancements, providing some sort of FX protections, and using the kind of capital that they can provide into the sector in much more innovative ways through creative financing structures. So I think that is something that is also something that the multilaterals can look at, whether it's the IFC or the World Bank or other ECA type agencies like KfW and so on. So I think that's one area that definitely they can look at. Um, Beyond that, I think it is also incumbent upon corporates in India to basically work on educating credit investors in these different markets and getting them up to speed on some of the risk issues and so on, so that overall different parts of the market become more comfortable lending to our sector, and we have more capital coming in. So I think there is a fairly significant onus on corporates as well to essentially carry through with education, de-risk the projects that we do, and make it more amenable towards financing from the green markets and the ESG markets. Um, so I would say there are some of these limitations that we have to look at. But as I look at the longer term, clearly the amount of capital that is going into our sector is increasing dramatically. And when I say our sector, I mean really more broadly ESG, the ESG area, the green financing area. And so to me, there is capital available. We just have to find the right way, the right structures, and so on to get this capital into our sector, which I'm sure will happen over time. So I think we will get there, but it does require effort and innovative, creative effort on our part as corporates and as financiers to bridge the gap between where the capital is sitting, looking to make investments, and the projects that we need to get financed to essentially move forward on meeting all of our climate change challenges in the future. So with that, let me stop. I think this is a terrific initiative on the part of Economic Times to have arranged this conference. This is really the need of the hour, and I must commend the organizers for having put together this thing with a stellar list of speakers and panel discussions. I hope that all of you have a great conference and a great next few sessions coming up. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.